Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are wrapping up lesson number 12 about the spinal cord. To help us prepare for the rest of the topics we're going to cover today and for the exam number 4, we're doing a little bit of review that correlates with labs. So the first thing we're doing here is we are looking at a cross section of an actual spinal cord. So instead of looking at a model showing us the parts of the spinal cord or a picture, we're looking at what it would actually look like on a microscope. There's 3 parts on this slide that we're labeling, and we want to help ourselves remember what we find in these places. Let's start here in the very middle. For my friends here in class today, what do I call this place in the very middle of the spinal cord here? What's this one called? Yeah, so this one here in the middle is called the Central Canal. The Central Canal is in the very center of the spinal cord. This is a place that we are full of something. What fills up the Central Canal? What's there in the middle? Yeah, CSF, Cerebrospinal Fluid, is found here in the Central Canal. I'll remind you as you're reviewing the flow of cerebrospinal fluid for the final exam when we're thinking about how the brain and the spinal cord relate to each other. This central canal actually connects to the 4th ventricle at the bottom of the brain. So between the cerebellum and the pons, the 4th ventricle actually connects to the central canal and shares its cerebrospinal fluid down here in the middle. We're going to talk about today a process called a spinal tap, where we remove cerebrospinal fluid to check it for bacteria or viruses. This would not be a great place for us to be taking fluid out of because it's in the very middle of the spinal cord. But there is also fluid that I find on the outside of the spinal cord in a special space. It's the same space as where we find cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the brain. Do you happen to remember the name of the cerebrospinal fluid filled space around the brain? We'll draw a little arrow.
Is it Subarachnoid Space?
Yes. So the place around the brain where in between the brain layers where we had cerebrospinal fluid was a place called the Sub Arachnoid Space. So the Sub Arachnoid Space is under the arachnoid mater. I think we talked about this last time when we were reviewing for lecture, but remember that the spinal cord has the exact same meninges or the exact same connective tissue around it as the brain does. So the arachnoid mater surrounds the spinal cord too. Underneath the arachnoid mater, we've got cerebrospinal fluid that circulates around the spinal cord, just like it circulated around the brain. So a teaser for us later today when we talk about a spinal tap, the place that a doctor would actually be removing cerebrospinal fluid, not from the very middle of your spinal cord, because that would damage the spinal cord. We're actually staying here on the outside in the area called the subarachnoid space. So the first thing we looked at here on this image was our central canal in the very middle of the spinal cord. The next thing we're looking at is this part of our spinal cord here. This is gray matter. When we talk about gray matter just in general in the spinal cord, what's the general term we use for any of these gray matter parts of the spinal cord? What are these parts called in the spinal cord? Yeah, these are called the horns. So we have 3 horns. This particular cross section, we can't see the lateral horn very well. Fun fact, we don't actually have a lateral horn everywhere in the spinal cord. We only have a lateral horn when we're looking at the thoracic area of the spinal cord, so around your chest. Otherwise, every other place is not going to have a lateral horn sticking out. So this cross section might be from the cervical region or it might be from the lumbar region. We don't see a lateral horn. That'd be over here on the side. We're missing it. I mentioned before we started the group work that if we had a dorsal root ganglion on this slide, we would see that dorsal root ganglion over here. That means that this particular gray horn would be called what? Based on the location of that ganglion. Yeah, this one here on the opposite side of the ganglion, this one's going to be the ventral, and I'll put in parentheses, gray horn, or the ventral horn. So the ventral horn of the spinal cord, we have a particular kind of neuron that lives here. Who lives in that ventral horn of the spinal cord? The ventral horn. Yeah, that's where we have motor neurons. And in particular, like Nicole mentioned, the specific kind of motor neurons we have, they're called somatic motor neurons. That means that these are the motor neurons that control skeletal muscle. So all the movements you decide to do are controlled by muscles, or controlled by neurons that live here in the ventral horn. If you remember from our last discussion, that lateral horn that's missing here, that lateral horn that would have been over here, that's where we found what were called autonomic motor neurons or visceral motor neurons. Those were the ones that control types of muscle that you don't control consciously. So the smooth muscle or cardiac muscle. So the other kind of motor neurons were called autonomic neurons. Or another word for them is visceral neurons. Those ones live in the lateral horn, which we did not label because it's missing. Last part of the spinal cord. So Nicole asked which way we'll list it on the exam. I believe I list it both ways. Yes, so autonomic and then in parentheses visceral, or visceral in parentheses autonomic. I believe that I gave you both of those terms. Yeah, so I'll try to check on that. If you remind me, I'll look for you to know for sure. But these terms mean the same thing. So as long as we know both of them, we should be able to pick it out. Last part of the spinal cord I asked us to label is this part, and really just the white matter in general. When we talk about the white matter of the spinal cord, there was a fancy, not English word from lab that I mentioned, but then we also have an easier word that we're going to use more in lecture. What do we call the white matter of the spinal cord? What is the white matter arranged in? White matter. Yeah, so the easy word for it, and the word that's going to make the most sense during today's class, because we're going to use that to talk about them, are tracts. If you look in your lab packets, the other fancy word for them is funiculi. But for the lecture exam, we're just going to go with English, because I like English better than, this is probably Latin, I don't know. So white matter tracts. This is what we find in all of the parts of the spinal cord that have white matter in them. When we talk about the white matter of the spinal cord, why is it white? What parts of a neuron or what chemical compound do we have a lot of in the tracts of the spinal cord? Yeah, this is the place in the spinal cord where we find those axons. And the axons are the part of a neuron that's covered in myelin, a myelin sheath. So the reason that the white matter of the spinal cord is white is because we're covered in axons, or we're filled with axons, excuse me, and those axons are covered in myelin. When we think about the function of axons, how would you describe the function of axons? What's the job of that part of a neuron? The axons of a neuron. Yeah, so Jacqueline's mentioning when we talk about axons, that's the part that sends messages. So we receive messages at the dendrites or at the cell body, and then those messages get sent away, or they go to where they're supposed to go to using the axons. So we're going to dive in just a bit to talk about the tracts of the spinal cord, the specific areas in the spinal cord where we have a lot of axons. The key with tracts is that this is where I send messages quickly. Either I send messages up really fast, or I send messages down really fast. I don't do any thinking or processing in a tract. I just send a message really fast. Just like an axon doesn't do summation or it doesn't do integration, it just sends messages away. If we're doing any processing, any integrating, we're going to do that here in the gray matter of the spinal cord. The white matter of the spinal cord is just really good at sending messages. Let's switch gears. One of the things that I promised you that you're going to have to do on exam number 4 is I'm going to give you a reflex that you've never seen before, and I'm going to ask you to make predictions about it using some of those words that we talked about in last class. So this particular reflex that we're looking at here, this is a picture of just a random reflex arc that we used in lab. In lab, we went through and we labeled all of the parts of the reflex arc. So let's work together and we'll label it just to remind ourselves. We started down here in the bottom of the reflex with the part of a reflex arc that collects information. What was the name of the part of the reflex arc where we collected information? What was this area down here called? Yeah, this is where I would find those receptors, the receptors down here. The receptors are the dendrites, or the receiving part of the type of neuron that I find here in yellow that goes all the way through that dorsal root ganglion into the spinal cord. This yellow neuron right here, how would I classify this one? What's my functional classification on this one? Yeah, this one is a sensory neuron. Sensory neuron. Hey, for kicks and giggles, I know lab is done, but in lab we also did the structural classification of this neuron. Do we remember what the structural classification of this one was? Yeah, this is, my sensory neurons are the only example of unipolar neurons that we have in the body, unipolar, because I've got my cell body and just one extension that comes down off of it. So my receptors receive information, they send that information through a sensory neuron into the spinal cord. Here's the spinal cord. When we talked about reflexes last time, I told you every time you see the spinal cord, I would describe this reflex using which word? Anytime I see the spinal cord, which word automatically applies? Yeah, not a trick question. Anytime I see the spinal cord, the word spinal automatically applies. So when you get to the question on the exam that I give you a completely new reflex, if you see something like this, if we see that spinal cord, we automatically know this is a spinal reflex. Remember, I told you if you see anything else, so it doesn't matter what it looks like, if it doesn't look like this, then we know that it's not spinal, we know that it's cranial. So if you reference back to the picture of the cranial reflex that we looked at, the blinking reflex, we didn't need to know for sure that that was going on in the brainstem. We just needed to know it wasn't happening in the spinal cord. So if you don't see the spinal cord, cranial reflex. Since we see the spinal cord, this is a spinal reflex. So my sensory neuron came into the spinal cord and it synapsed with, or it's talking to, this thinking neuron, or this processing neuron here in the middle. What's the name of processing neurons? What's this middle one called? Yeah, processing neurons are my interneurons. So I've got an interneuron inside here. This neuron's going to figure out what we should do, what kind of response we should have, and it's going to tell that to my last kind of neuron that I see here. This neuron leaves the spinal cord and goes out to muscles to make something happen. Which kind of neuron is this orange neuron right here? What's its functional classification? Yeah, this is my last type. This is my motor neuron. My motor neuron sends a message to what we call the effector. The effector, which is the thing that makes something happen in your body. The goal of a reflex is to receive information and to make something happen really quickly. That's the goal of a reflex. So my effector is where I send that information. Now, we have two other classification words we need to figure out here. If we're monosynaptic or polysynaptic, when I look at any reflex, how would I know which of these words to use? What does monosynaptic or polysynaptic, what do these words even mean? These synaptic words. Yeah, so Nicole's mentioning, and the easiest way to think about it, it's the number of synapses, or the number of places where neurons meet to talk to each other. That's a synapse. So when I look at this particular reflex, I have one space here where my sensory neuron meets with my interneuron, and one space here where my interneuron meets with my motor neuron. I have two synapses. Two is more than one. Monosynaptic means there's one synapse. Since I have two, that means that this is a polysynaptic reflex, a polysynaptic reflex. If we didn't want to count the number of synapses, I'll just mention this too. Anytime you have an interneuron, any reflex with an interneuron is going to be a polysynaptic reflex. So if I have a processing neuron wedged in the middle, I'm obviously going to have at least two reflexes, maybe more than that. So anytime there's an interneuron, always a polysynaptic reflex. The last thing that I asked us to do with our reflexes is to classify whether they are ipsilateral or contralateral. And this has to do with the side of the body that responds to a reflex, or the sides of the body that are responding. If I use this word ipsilateral, what does ipsilateral mean? Ipsilateral? Yeah, ipsilateral. This ipsy part here at the beginning, that means that we're on the same side, ipsilateral. If I talk about contralateral, that means we're on the other side, contra being opposed to or opposite. When you look at a reflex, the side that the sensory neuron goes in, we want to compare that to the side that the motor neuron goes out. Because the sensory neuron and the motor neuron both go in and out on the same side of the spinal cord, this particular reflex is an ipsilateral reflex, an ipsilateral reflex. So here's what we've done with this lab model. We've used it to remind ourselves what monosynaptic and polysynaptic mean. We've used it to remind ourselves what a cranial and a spinal reflex would mean. And we've used it to compare ipsilateral to contralateral. As you're studying for exam number 4, to prepare for getting reflexes like this one on the exam, do a Google Images search. Just type in reflex arc. There are tons and tons of pictures of different reflex arcs out there. See if you can classify them using these words. So number of synapses it has, where we do our integration, which sides sensory and motor information go. The more you practice with those images from Google, the better or more comfortable you'll be when we get to that on the exam. How do we feel about these two things so far? Thumbs up? Awesome. I got thumbs up and good. Perfect. Well, then with that, we will dive back into where we left off last time. Last time we finished by talking about reflexes. And when we think about reflexes in the spinal cord, is that something that happens in the white matter of the spinal cord or in the gray matter of the spinal cord? Which part did we do the reflexes in? Yeah, so Nicole is right. When we talk about reflexes, we have sensory information that comes in through the dorsal root, and it synapses with interneurons in the dorsal horn. It sends directions to motor neurons in the ventral horn, and that information comes out. When we talk about a reflex, it's all about the gray matter of the spinal cord. Sometimes what happens in the body, though, is some sensory information comes in, and my interneuron back here in the dorsal horn says, wait a minute, this sensory information is above my pay grade. Like literally, I can't process this. It's got to go up to the brain. If that kind of information comes in to the interneuron is going to send that information up to the brain using a tract. So sometimes when information comes into the gray matter, the neuron back there realizes, I can't deal with this. I need somebody with more thinking power to figure it out. That's what happens with all the information that you receive that doesn't cause a reflexive response, that we don't have a reflex response to. We use a tract to send it up to the brain. So remember from lab, we said that they were called white matter tracts, or our not English word was white matter funiculi. We said during our group work that white matter is really good at sending messages. So messages that come in that the spinal cord itself can't deal with, it's going to use a tract or a funiculus to send that information elsewhere. Now, at the same time that I send information up to the brain, I also need to be able to send information down from the brain. For example, when you are taking notes, when you're typing, when you're texting a friend, hopefully not in class, all of those things are motor directions that you're sending from the brain down to the body. Those directions that come from the brain, let's remind ourselves, what was the name of the part of the brain where you decided to start a movement? Where was the part that you decided to make a movement happen? Conscious decision to move. Yeah, so it comes from the frontal lobe. There was a particular part in the frontal lobe where we sent those specific directions. Yeah, so the specific directions came from that place called the Pre-Central Gyrus. The Pre-Central Gyrus. And remember that in the Pre-Central Gyrus, we had that thing called the motor homunculus. The motor homunculus, the map that controlled all the parts of the body. So when we decide to move in the frontal lobe with our pre-central gyrus or inside the pre-central gyrus, I need to get those decisions or those directions out of the brain. I need to get them down to the muscles that I'm telling to move. That's the job of some of these tracts we're seeing here in red. The red tracts that you see on the left side of the spinal cord over here, we call these tracts descending tracts. Oops, descending tracts. When you're studying tracts, I want you to always think about descending tracts as the same thing as motor tracts. These are synonyms to each other. A descending tract is a motor tract. And what I mean by that is the kind of information that's traveling quickly through a descending tract is motor information. It's making stuff happen. Now, the opposite side of my picture over here is showing me what we call ascending tracts. Ascending tracts. Ascending tracts are the same thing as sensory tracts. They're sending sensory information. Now, this word here, ascending, if we ascend a staircase, we're going up a staircase. This word over here, descending, if we descend a staircase, we're walking down. You should know when we talk about descending tracts or motor tracts that information goes down. So I'm sending information from the brain or from the brainstem down to the muscles of the body. When I talk about ascending tracts, I'm sending information from the body, wherever we're receiving sensory information, up to the brain or up to the brainstem. So this word ascending does mean literally that information goes up, it ascends. And this word descending does mean literally that information goes down. The good news for you is that I'm not going to make you memorize specific tracts. We are going to work through and talk about the kind of information I get from their names. But all of these little labels that you see on here relate to the names of different tracts. So I'm going to show you how I can use their names to figure things out. Yes, I've got a question in the chat that asks if descending is always on the left and ascending is always on the right. It's a great question. The answer to that question is actually no. So check this out. I'm going to do some really bad drawing here. Imagine that the white spaces on one half of my picture are filled in with red. So imagine that we've got a mirror image going on here. And then on the left side of the picture, imagine that those white spaces are filled in with blue. So we actually have each of these tracts on both sides of the spinal cord. Think about this kind of like if you were doing art and you put paint on one half of your paper and you folded it. We see all of these tracts on both sides of the spinal cord. So the left and the right side has both sensory and motor tracts. So imagine, like I said, if you folded a paper in half and you split it, had paint in it, pushed it together, and then split it out, we have sensory tracts all over here, sensory tracts on the outside in both of these places, motor tracts in this place on both sides. So you would have a left and a right of each of these things. It's just for the sake of clarity, this picture only showed it on one side. Now I'm going to be totally honest with you. I'm never going to ask you to distinguish between left and right in terms of a sensory or a motor tract. So don't worry too much about it. But what you should know is when we talk about tracts, which is all the white matter of the spinal cord, all of the spinal cord is filled with these super highways. I like to think about them like super highways. We're always sending information up. We're always sending information down. Everywhere is full of ascending tracts and descending tracts. Does that help with the question? Okay, perfect. So let's talk about tracts. When we are talking about tracts, I will mention first off that I don't want you to memorize specific things about these tracts. What I do want you to be able to do with tracts is I want you to be able to use the name of a tract to figure out if it's sensory or motor. And I want you to be able to give me an idea of where I find the neurons that are in that tract. So let's start with this one here. This one here is called the Spinothalamic Tract. The Spinothalamic Tract. With any of these tracts that we're looking at, their name is going to tell me information about where things are found. So let's start here with this spino part in its name. Yeah, when I say spino, spino means the spinal cord. Spinal cord. And I've got that thalamic part of its name. What does thalamic sound like? Thalamic. Yeah, it sounds like that structure we learned in lab called the thalamus, the relay center of the brain. Okay, so check this out. This tract is called the Spinothalamic Tract. Spino comes first, so that means I start in the spinal cord. Thalamic comes second. That means I'm going to the thalamus. The Spinothalamic Tract goes from the spinal cord to the brain. I'm going from a lower location to a higher location. Would I say that this is an ascending tract or a descending tract? What kind of tract would this be, since we go from the spinal cord to the brain? Yeah, this is going to be an ascending tract. Ascending tract. We are sending information. Info goes up. The spinal cord is where we start. The thalamus is where we end up. Question in the chat about where exactly the thalamus is. The thalamus is in the very middle of the cerebrum. So it is above the cerebellum. It's in the very middle of the big part of the brain. Think about where we had the duck face on the brain models. Yeah, just below the fornix, just below the corpus callosum, that big area in the very middle, that's the thalamus. Okay, so far I've looked at the name of this tract, spinothalamic. I started in the spinal cord, I went up to the thalamus. That tells me that this is an ascending tract. When I talk about ascending tracts, were those sensory or motor tracts? Ascending tracts. Yeah, ascending tracts are sensory tracts. Sensory. They're sending information up. So sensory information always goes up. Motor information always goes down. When we talk about ascending tracts, something that it should always tip off in our mind when we hear the word ascending tract. Ascending tracts have 3 neurons. Ascending tracts have 3 neurons. And you can see over here on the left, and I apologize, I pulled this from Not English, which is why we've got the extra E here. We've got 3 neurons that are involved in an ascending tract. We have what's called the first order neuron. That's the neuron that comes first, unsurprisingly. We have what's called the second order neuron, and then we have that third order neuron. When we're trying to figure out the functions of each of these neurons or what they're doing, a first order neuron is the sensory neuron that collects the sensory information. So you can see it in our picture here. This sensory neuron, with its cell body and the dorsal root ganglion, comes into the spinal cord, and it synapses with an interneuron. That interneuron, when we're talking about tracts, is what we call the second order neuron. The second order neuron gets this sensory information from the neuron and says, wait a minute, this is above my pay grade. I don't know what this means. I can't do anything with this. So that interneuron, rather than forming a reflex arc and talking to a motor neuron, that interneuron says, we are sending this information up to the brain. I can't even with it. I don't know what to do. I'm sending it up. So a second order neuron is an interneuron that takes the sensory information and sends it up to the brain. Now, this particular tract, the place in the brain that we were sending it to, is the thalamus. Remember that we said that the thalamus does a couple of things. The thalamus filters information. So if there's sensory information that doesn't need to go anywhere, we just need to edit it out. We don't want to care about it. The thalamus would get rid of it. But the thalamus also sorted sensory information and sent it to the right place in your sensory homunculus. So the thalamus is the location of what we call the third order neurons. The third order neurons are the neurons that take the information to the correct place in the sensory homunculus, in the pre-central gyrus, so that you can process it and realize, oh, something is touching my finger, or oh, something is touching my arm, or whatever part of that map we're on. The third order neuron gets the information to the place in the brain that it's supposed to go. So let's make a list here with our neurons. My first order neuron. The first order neuron is the sensory neuron, the sensory neuron. That's the neuron that's collecting the sensory information from the body. Let's see if we can actually see yellow. The second order neuron, kind of hard to see there, but the second order neuron is an interneuron that's doing the processing. That information comes into the spinal cord. The interneuron says, I can't process this, I can't do anything, I'm sending it up to the brain. The third order neuron is another interneuron, but the job of this interneuron is kind of to sort the information or send it to the right place. And Nicole's totally right, I misspoke there. When we're talking about where this sensory information goes, it's not going to the pre-central gyrus. I apologize. It's going to the post-central gyrus because it's sensory information. So that third order neuron goes to the right place in the post-central gyrus. In the post-central gyrus. I could ask you on the assignment or on the exam where we would find each of these types of neurons here, the first order neuron, the second order neuron, and the third order neuron. Third order neurons always start in the thalamus. They go from the thalamus to the right place on that post-central gyrus. My second order neurons spend almost their entire life in the spinal cord. They're shooting up in the white matter of the spinal cord. Their axon goes through there. My first order neurons start in the sensory receptors of the body. Yeah, so I find them in sensory nerves, in that dorsal root, and they end in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. That's where they put off their axon terminal. So sensory neurons, first order neurons, they're found throughout the body. They take information in through that dorsal root. Second order neurons, they start in the dorsal horn, but go up the tracts, the white matter, into the brain. Third order neurons typically are going to start in the thalamus and go to places on that post-central gyrus. Now, I'll mention with the Spinothalamic Tract that you'll see in my picture here, there's more than one of them. There's what's called the anterior spinothalamic tract, and there's what's called the lateral spinothalamic tract. Hey, this is not a trick question. What does the word anterior mean? What does anterior mean? Exactly. Anterior means toward the front. Notice that I have the anterior spinothalamic tract. It's found toward the front of the spinal cord. I also have the lateral spinothalamic tract. What did that word lateral mean again? What's lateral? Yeah, lateral means I'm more toward the side. So I've got two places in the spinal cord where I'm sending information straight up from the spinal cord to the thalamus. One of them is closer to the front. One of them is farther to the side. Their name tells me where I would find them. I'm not going to ask you for the particular types of sensory information that each tracts carry, but notice that the anterior spinothalamic tract has information about touch and information about pressure. So if you're touching something and you're feeling that it's circular, for example, crude touch, that's kind of big picture, what's the shape of something? That kind of information would be sent up to the brain using the anterior spinothalamic tract. So using this interneuron that goes up more toward the front. If we're detecting something like what I'm touching is hot, or it's so hot it burned me, that kind of information, the interneuron is going to send up through a slightly different location, the lateral spinothalamic tract. Here's the big idea with lateral and anterior. Different tracts, so different areas in the white matter of the spinal cord, send different kinds of sensory information. So my second order neuron can travel through the anterior spinothalamic tract with things like pressure information, or my second order neuron might travel through the lateral spinothalamic tract. If it goes that way, it's going to have temperature or pain information. But regardless of which of these tracts I'm traveling in, this second order neuron is always found in the spinal cord, in that white matter of the spinal cord, going all the way up to the thalamus, where it's going to synapse with the third order neuron. Before I move on to the next tract, do we have any questions about the spinothalamic tract?
I guess I'm just a little more confused now. So the big idea for ascending tracts is the first order neuron is the receptors, the sensory neuron that collects information, correct?
Correct.
And then the second order neuron is what is taken to the inner neuron that basically, well, you said it doesn't process, right? It just sends it up to the thalamus.
Yeah, so the second order neuron gets the information and says, I don't know what to do with this. I'm sending it up.
Okay. And that goes to the thalamus, which then sorts it to the right part of the brain.
Correct.
But it's normally just the post-central gyrus for sensory information, right?
Yes, so the kind of information that we're sending in these tracts is going to be general sensory information. So
Okay.
information like temperature and pain, things like touch and pressure. We would never send vision information through a tract. We would never send hearing information through a tract. Tracts are only used for general sensory information. Special sensory information has its own thing that it does, but we're only doing general sensory information with these tracts.
Okay. So as long as we know, though, it does, the third order does end in the thalamus. That's correct.
The third order starts in the thalamus. Yep, it starts in the thalamus and it goes up to the correct place on that post-central gyrus.
Okay. Okay. Got it.
And that's a good tie-in, actually, to our other ascending tract that we're going to talk about, which is called the spinocerebellar tract. The spinocerebellar tract. Let's break down its name again. We have the beginning spino in it, which still means the same thing. What did spino mean again? Yeah, spino still means the spinal cord. Now we have the word cerebellar. Cerebellar. What does cerebellar seem like, or what does that look like? Yeah, so cerebellar looks like and means cerebellum. The next ascending tract that we're talking about, the spinocerebellar tract, we start in the spinal cord and we end in the cerebellum. When I go from the spinal cord to the cerebellum, I am still going up. This is still an example of an ascending tract. And remind me, with ascending tracts, what kind of information do I send in an ascending tract? Yeah, ascending tracts, like Nicole mentioned, those are sensory tracts. This is another example of sensory information being sent upward. But check this out. We start in the spinal cord and we end in the cerebellum. We start in the spinal cord. Here's my first order neuron. My first order neuron synapses with a second order neuron that travels up the spinal cord in the spinocerebellar tract and ends at the cerebellum. What am I missing that I normally have in an ascending tract? What do I not see on here? Yeah, I'm not seeing in the spinocerebellar tract because there is not one. There is no third order neuron. No third order neuron. Now here's where I'm going to make you stretch your mind a little bit or think a little bit. Where was it that we said we found the third order neuron? Where did the third order neuron start? Yeah, so the third order neuron starts, for all of my track, it starts in the thalamus. The third order neuron starts in the thalamus, but in this particular tract, we never go to the thalamus. In the spinocerebellar tract, we go to the cerebellum instead of the thalamus. So because I didn't end up in the thalamus, I don't have a third order neuron there. The spinocerebellar tract has a first order neuron that's collecting sensory information from what are called muscle spindle proprioceptors. That word proprioceptors, we haven't talked about it a lot. It's just a fancy word for something that detects stretching. So my sensory neuron inside a muscle detects how stretched out it is. It sends that stretching information to my second order neuron in the spinal cord. The second order neuron says, I don't know what to do with this. Sounds like information I should send up. Using the white matter spinocerebellar tract, the second order neuron goes up to the cerebellum, where the cerebellum is going to process it and use it to help you stay balanced, or use it to make sure that you're moving the way that you're supposed to move. It's going to help you with the process of coordination. So the spinocerebellar tract is a special example of an ascending tract because instead of having 3 neurons in it, it only has 2 neurons. It's missing its third order neuron because the third order neuron is always in the thalamus, and this one never gets there. We don't get to the thalamus, so we don't have a third order neuron. With these tracts, keep in mind, you should always start by looking for clues in its name. Spinocerebellar, we broke that down to spinal cord and cerebellum. We broke down spinothalamic into spinal cord and thalamus. So use these names, break them down to help you figure out if we are ascending, or, as we'll see on our next one here, if we are descending. We're looking at an example of something called the corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract. This word cortico, for those of us that have worked through it in the lesson, what did cortico refer to? Do we remember? What does cortico mean? Yeah, so cortico looks a lot like the word cortex. Cortex. We talked about this in the brain chapter. The outside of the brain is called the cerebral cortex, the gray matter of the brain, the cerebral cortex. So I've got what's called the corticospinal tract. Cortico means the cerebral cortex, the outside of the brain, and spinal still means spinal cord. Still means spinal cord. I'm starting in the brain, the cerebral cortex. I'm going down in the spinal cord. This is our first example of a descending tract. A descending tract. And when we talked about descending tracts, what kind of information did I send in a descending tract? What kind of information goes down? Yeah, motor information is the kind that goes down. Now, in particular, with a the corticospinal tract, we're sending down information from the pre-central gyrus. This is information about movements that you've decided to do. That was your decision. It's conscious decision, conscious movement. We use the corticospinal tract to take notes or to click with our mouse, all those kinds of things. When we talk about a motor tract, here's some terminology you should know. First term we should know is what we call an upper motor neuron. Upper motor neuron. An upper motor neuron is the first neuron in this chain. The upper motor neuron is where the decision for what movement we're going to do, that's where it starts. So in the case of the corticospinal tract, we are starting on the pre-central gyrus. Our upper motor neuron lives here. It sends its axon all the way down through the brainstem, all this is brainstem stuff, till we get to the spinal cord, and we start traveling through the white matter of the spinal cord. When we get to the part of the body where we're ready to cause an action to happen, so we're trying to click our mouse, for example, we would get to the level of the spinal cord where we have the motor neurons that talk to your arm muscles. At that point, my upper motor neuron would synapse with my lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron leaves the spinal cord and goes out to the body to talk to muscles. So the upper motor neuron, we find that one in this case in the brain. It starts in the brain, it goes down the spinal cord until we synapse with the lower motor neuron. So the lower motor neuron starts in the spinal cord. In particular, here we'll be specific here, it's in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and it leaves the spinal cord and goes out to skeletal muscle. Here's kind of an underline highlight star idea. You should never, ever tell me that upper motor neurons or lower motor neurons are found in an ascending tract. You should never tell me that a sensory tract, an ascending tract that's sensory, it would never have an upper motor neuron or a lower motor neuron. These types of neurons are only found in descending tracts. When I talk about ascending tracts, the ones we were talking about before, ascending tracts, do you remember what the names were of the neurons that are in ascending tracts? My sensory tracts. Yeah, so the sensory tracts had first order neurons, they had second order neurons, and they had third order neurons. My first order neurons were the neurons that had the receptors, and they went to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Those second order neurons started in the dorsal horn, and they traveled up to the thalamus. And the third order neurons were in the thalamus, and they went up to the post-central gyrus. Never tell me that a first, second, or third order neuron is in a descending tract, and never tell me that upper motor neurons or lower motor neurons are in an ascending tract. Make sure we can keep track of which kind of neurons live in what kind of tracts. So this is a descending tract, the corticospinal tract, because I start in the brain, the cerebral cortex, and go down to the spinal cord. That tells me we've got motor information. That tells me we've got an upper motor neuron in the brain and a lower motor neuron that leaves through the spinal cord. Let's compare that to what's called the vestibulospinal tract. Vestibulospinal tract. Now, we may not know for sure what vestibulo means, but if we look at our picture here, we are somewhere above the spinal cord. We can see that from our name too, right? Spinal still means spinal cord. Yeah, so spinal part still means spinal cord. And Jacqueline's chiming in, she's right. This vestibulo part, we had that cranial nerve, remember, called the vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve. It did relate to the ear. There was actually two things that the vestibulocochlear nerve helped us to do. What were those things that cranial nerve number 8 helped us to do? Vestibulocochlear. Yeah, so the two things it did hearing and balance. We'll type its name here. Vestibulocochlear. The cochlear part of its name was the hearing portion of what this nerve does. The vestibulo part of its name was the vestibule, which we're going to talk about more in the next lecture chapter. That was my equilibrium or my balance. So when we talk about the vestibulospinal tract, we are talking about the part of the ear called the vestibule. The vestibule is the part that helps you with balance, with equilibrium. We're starting up in the brainstem that's collecting information from the ears for balance. We're ending in the spinal cord because of the spinal part. This is another example of a descending tract. An example of something where we start higher and end lower. Because it is a descending tract, what are the names of the types of neurons that I find in this tract? It's a descending tract. Yeah, it's motor neurons. So what were the two names that I had for those motor neurons? We've got motor neurons. Yeah, so the motor neurons, they're easy. We have the upper motor neuron and we have the lower motor neuron. We're in a motor tract, so we've got an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. Now, this particular tract, notice how we're webbing all over the place. We're going nuts. We have the upper motor neuron that's here in the brain stem region, and it synapses with our lower motor neurons that go down and out to the muscles of the body to help you with, for example, your back muscles or your arms or your legs. The upper motor neuron in this tract in the brain stem, the lower motor neuron in the spinal cord, leaving to go out to our parts of the body. What questions do we have about tracts? Or shoot me an emoji. How do we feel about them in general, even if we don't have any questions? Here's my daily penguin is gone. Let's find him. Come back, penguin. There we go. Here's my daily penguin. Yes, thank you for reminding me, Nicole. The one other thing that we need to know about our motor pathways is whether they are direct or indirect. The easiest way to think about direct and indirect with our motor pathways is, do the directions come straight from the cerebrum and go down to the body? Or do the directions kind of meander and go various places? Do they come from the brainstem and the cerebellum? If they don't come directly from the cerebrum, we would call it an indirect motor pathway. This is a good example of an indirect motor pathway because we're not using the cerebrum. We don't see the cerebrum here. We just see the brainstem. If we go back to the corticospinal tract, though, we started up here in the cerebrum. So we went straight from the cerebrum down to the body. This is an example of a direct motor pathway. So when you're trying to interpret these tracts and figure out whether they're a direct motor pathway or an indirect motor pathway, look for the cerebrum. Do we see the cerebrum calling the shots, or do we see some other part of the body calling the shots? If somebody else calls the shots, that's going to be an example of an indirect pathway. Any other, I don't think I have, yeah. Any other questions about the tracts? Okay, so let's do an application, a medical application of these tracts. And that medical application is something called Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. Let's see if I can spell it correctly, what ALS stands for. So ALS is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Here we go. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So ALS, you have probably heard of ALS because of the thing called the Ice Bucket Challenge that was popular a few years back. That's probably your main exposure to amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, this is basically a muscle wasting disease. So in a normal patient, we've got a neuron, a motor neuron, that is synapsing with the muscle cell. When we synapse with a muscle cell, that causes a muscle contraction to happen. But in patients with ALS, their muscles get wasted, or we call it atrophy, kind of like the whole idea, you use it or you lose it. Well, in patients with ALS, they're losing their muscle all the time. At the same time, what we see in ALS patients too, though, is that their neurons are a little bit wasted, or their neurons aren't as active as we would see in normal tissue. So one of the things that I had you do with this lesson was look at what's called an abstract. So an abstract is basically a summary of the work that somebody did. I like to joke with students that this paragraph right here, this 8 to 10 sentences here, probably represents something like 2 years of someone's life doing really hardcore research, and then we just summarize it in 2 paragraphs. That's the way that science works for you. So somebody spent, a year or 2 years of their life doing a really interesting experiment, and then they summarized it down for you to just 1 paragraph. This is a study that they did to figure out what was going on in ALS. See, in ALS, we just talked about on the previous slide how the muscles in a person's body get smaller. They're getting smaller because the neurons aren't sending messages for them to contract. So they are not using it, they're losing it. So this particular study was completed to look at cortical motor neurons and lower motor neurons. We just talked about lower motor neurons, and we had another name for these cortical motor neurons. What was the name that we called them? Those neurons that I found in the cerebral cortex. I didn't call them cortical neurons. I called them, in an easier person word, upper motor neurons. Upper motor neurons. So when we see in our summary down here talking about cortical motor neurons, those are upper motor neurons. When we see talking about lower motor neurons, these are the ones like we talked about before, the ones that are the second in line. The goal of this study was to figure out whether it was my upper motor neurons, my brain neurons, that aren't sending a message for muscles to contract, or whether it was my lower motor neurons, my neurons that talked to the muscles that weren't sending the message for the muscles to contract. So let's look at this summary. I am missing my yellow and green parts, so we'll work together to figure out where yellow and green are. So let's look at our abstract here. So it says, it has been suggested that the degeneration or the dying of lower motor neurons in ALS is, now we're going to use some words that we don't know, right? It's okay, we don't have to know them. A transneuronal event, secondary to the loss of corticospinal and corticobulbar neurons. Now, we don't know what this means, but we know this word right here. When we talk about corticospinal, that's that tract that sent information from the cerebrocortex down to the spinal cord. Hey, I've got another tract here. We didn't talk about this one, but the Corticobulbur Tract. This is directions start in the cerebral cortex and they go down into the brain stem. So this isn't the spinal cord anymore. This is down into this brain stem. Because see, one of the problems with ALS is people lose their ability to do things like talking or swallowing. Those are the kind of movements that came from cranial nerves that live in the brain stem. So we're looking at motor pathways from the brain to the spinal cord that would help us with general movement, and from the brain to the brain stem that help us with some of those functions like eating or talking. So to figure out who's dying or which kind of neuron is giving us trouble, whether it's the upper or lower motor neuron, they took cross sections, or they chopped up the pyramidal cells, that's just cells shaped like a pyramid, that were found in layer 5, the 5th row, of the foot and tongue areas of the pre-central gyrus. Now, there's a lot that we don't understand in that section there, but we should know this. The pre-central gyrus. What was going on in the pre-central gyrus? What's its job? or who lives here? What's up with the pre-central gyrus? Yeah, Nicole's mentioning movement. It's the motor area. This is where when you decide to do a movement, this is where that movement comes from. So in particular, so the pre-central gyrus, absolutely right. That's the place where we had that motor map of your body. What they did is they looked at the foot area on that motor map, and they looked at the tongue area on that motor map. So you could go back to your brain notes and you could look at the shape of the motor homunculus on that map. What these scientists did is they took a little section of the cells that lived in the area that controlled the foot and in the area that controlled the tongue, and they looked at the size of those neurons that lived there in the pre-central gyrus, the ones that are supposed to control the foot and supposed to control the tongue. Then they went down to something called the hypoglossal nucleus. Now, all we need to know about this is hypoglossal, like the nerve. This is, yeah, cranial nerve number 12. So where cranial nerve number 12 starts in the brainstem, they looked at the neurons that lived there, where cranial nerve number 12 starts. And they looked at the neurons that lived in the ventral horns of the L4 part of the spinal cord. L4 is referring to the fourth lumbar vertebra, or the fourth lumbar region of the spinal cord. When I look at the neurons that live in these places, these are going to be the neurons that go out and actually talk to my muscle tissue. Now we're looking at two motor tracts. So remember that motor tracts have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. When I'm talking about the neurons that live in the spinal cord, so the ventral horns of the spinal cord, was that my upper motor neuron or my lower motor neuron? Who lives in the spinal cord? Yeah, Nicole's right. The spinal cord, and I believe this is the part that was underlined in green. My neurons that live in these two places are an example of my lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons. I'll move that. When I start talking about, let's underline my yellow part too. When I'm talking about the parts of the pre-central gyrus, so foot and tongue area of the pre-central gyrus, those are my upper motor neurons. The goal of this study was to look at the upper motor neurons and to look at the lower motor neurons to figure out who's getting smaller or who's dying. Is the reason that lower motor neurons don't talk to muscles because something's wrong with them? Or is the reason that they're not talking because the upper motor neurons aren't talking to them? We're kind of trying to do the chicken and the egg thing here. Who died first? The ones that live in the brain or the ones that live next to the muscle? What's causing us to not be able to contract? So they took little pieces of the brain tissue from either the pre-central gyrus or from the brainstem or from the spinal cord. They looked at these cells, and here's where we get to our blue statement. It said cortical neurons and lower motor neurons were significantly smaller in the cases of ALS. Now here's where we have to change our terminology a little bit, right? Remember we said that cortical neurons, the other name for them are the upper motor neurons. So upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons were significantly smaller in the cases of ALS. What they found in this study is both kinds of neurons, the ones that I had in the brain where I decided to do muscle contraction, and the ones that I had in the spinal cord or the brainstem that made the contraction happen, both of those had shrunk. We had neuronal shrinkage, or we're losing our ability to send messages through both of those types of neurons. So it's hard for us to say which came first. Is it the ones that make the decision to move, or is it the ones that send out the message to move? We don't know which one is causing the paralysis that we see in ALS, but we know that both types of neurons are affected in ALS. Now, when I talk about this with students in class with me, I always like to point out that this particular research article is now really old. Look at my date here. This was done in 1991. We've got a small class today, but are any of us here, this research was done before you were born? Anybody? I was alive when this was born. I was not doing science yet, or when this was written, when this was born. Yeah, Jacqueline says that this was done before her time. So this was done before, not done before my time. I was around for this one, but I mentioned that to say this is what you might call one of the fundamental papers in the field. So ALS research has come a long way since this. This paper told us that this is a problem with upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons causing our ALS disease, causing muscles to waste away. They actually were very successful with the Ice Bucket Challenge. That raised a lot of money for ALS research. They continue to do research on that. There is a few articles out there about ALS and about the Ice Bucket Challenge. Tragically, both of the two men who really pioneered that Ice Bucket Challenge, the second one just recently died. So that's a tragedy, unfortunately. But yeah, very, very interesting disease. Yeah, so Nicole, when to your question about how they did this, I believe this was work done on cadavers. I don't believe these were alive individuals because you wouldn't be able to remove cells without loss of function. So I believe this was work that was done on cadavers of individuals who had ALS versus control subjects, like it mentions here. Usually what I do in class with this too is we make a word map of the words that we understand and the words that we don't understand. One of the words that we understand most of the time from our Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease discussion is sporadic ALS. Does anyone remember what that sporadic word meant when we were talking about human mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob's? Yeah, so sporadic, no known cause. ALS can run in families. It is genetic. But for this particular study, they took 12 individuals who we don't know where it came from, that they had ALS, and they studied their brain. Again, like I said, I believe it was post-mortem. So after death, they studied to see the size of these neurons. So look at you all. You've read maybe your first scientific abstract. We may not have understood everything, but hopefully you feel like you understand a little bit about what this paper was communicating for us. What I want to talk about briefly now are some of those spaces in the spinal cord and medical applications of them. So remember at the beginning of today, we talked about the subarachnoid space. What did we say that the subarachnoid space is filled with? What's inside the subarachnoid space? Yeah, this is the location of cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Remember that the subarachnoid space is found between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, Just like in the brain, the pia mater of the spinal cord touches the spinal cord. The arachnoid mater is just outside of it. So the fluid-filled space between them is called the subarachnoid space. I want to mention this. This is something you should make a note of in your packet. Our picture here has labeled something called the subdural space. This is not actually a real space unless you're dead. If you're dead, we can see the subdural space. When you're alive, this doesn't exist. Yeah, so Jacqueline says she crossed it out. Yeah, because you'll see some questions on the homework or on the test that this is what we call a distractor answer. It's not correct because this place doesn't actually exist. If it was a real space, the name is called subdural. Where would I find it? Subdural. Where would that be found? Yeah, exactly. Sub means below. Dural means the dura mater. So when a person dies, their dura mater and their arachnoid mater kind of space out from each other. When you're alive, there's nothing here. It's not actually a space. They're connected. But here's the other space that I want to draw your attention to up here, called the epidural space. Do we remember what this beginning part epi means? What was epi? Like the epidermis. Yeah, epi means above. So there's also this space in the spinal cord called the epidural space. The epidural space is above the dura mater. Can we tell from the picture or from our work on this assignment, what do I find in the epidural space? Epidural space. Yeah, the epidural space is filled with adipose. It's filled with fat tissue. Hey, so the epidural space is the location in the spinal cord where if a woman is having an epidural during childbirth, this is the location where that medication is administered, into the epidural space. Yeah, Karina says the best thing. I totally agree with you. As you all know, I believe we all know, I had a baby 6 months ago, and when they gave me my epidural, it made me realize that I guess my first epidural didn't work nearly as well as I thought it did because, oh my goodness, I loved my epidural. It was amazing. So my epidural, they put a needle into the epidural space. They put medication into this space, and that medication then goes into, it diffuses through into the spinal cord and numbs the neurons, the sensory neurons that are in here. You don't feel those sensations. Now check this out. We're going to do a really cool application question here. Epidural anesthesia. When you put medication into the epidural space, when we think about the chemistry of the kinds of medicine that we could put in here, we want that medicine to diffuse through this connective tissue and get to the spinal cord. What chemistry words could we use to describe the kind of medicine or the properties of epidural anesthesia? What kind would have the easiest chance of getting from inside adipose tissue into the spinal cord? Yeah, exactly right, Jacqueline. The most effective types of anesthesia are the ones that can pass through the membrane, things that are lipid soluble, things that are non-polar or hydrophobic, all of those same kind of words that you use to describe what can get into a cell. It's the same kind of deal here. What's going to be able to get through the dura mater on the outside and the arachnoid mater and the pia mater to get to the spinal cord, it's all of the exact same chemistry. Dr. Wallace's favorite questions, right? So things that are nonpolar, things that are hydrophobic, things that are lipid soluble, all of that is the kind of stuff that is the most effective kinds of anesthetics. So the ones that can pass straight through those layers to cause numbing. Nicole asked a question about back problems with the epidural. Yeah, it's possible when the needle went in that maybe it went in a little too far. It's possible that the medication went in too fast and put a lot of pressure on the vertebral canal. So there's several different things that could have gone wrong. Best case scenario, if an epidural is doing the right thing, it only goes, the needle and the medication only goes into this space out here. It should not be going deeper because that should protect you from having issues with the needle bumping into the spinal cord. But yeah, there is a risk associated with an epidural. If we put too much pressure, if we bump into the spinal cord, that can be very painful and cause some serious issues. Yeah, the side effects of an epidural, absolutely. One of the things that we talked about in the guided lesson is the way that you would test someone for what's called meningitis. So meningitis is a disease. It's the swelling of the meninges. So if the dura mater and the arachnoid mater and the pia mater all get swollen because of a bacterial infection or a viral infection, that's really bad news, especially when it leads to swelling around the brain stem. What did the brain stem part of your brain do? What does your brain stem do? So like the pons and the medulla oblongata, what's their job? Yeah, those were the parts of the brain. If you remember when we talked about a person being in a coma, if they're still breathing, heart's still beating, that's the part of them that's still working. The brainstem keeps you alive, but the brainstem is covered in meninges. If those connective tissue layers that wrap around the brainstem start to get swollen, they can put pressure on it and make you stop breathing or make your heart beat erratically. That's the problem with meningitis. We put too much pressure on the brain, and ultimately we can't sustain life. So to diagnose meningitis, whether you've got bacteria or viruses or that kind of stuff in your cerebrospinal fluid, that's how we would know you have meningitis. We need to go to a place in the spinal cord where we have cerebrospinal fluid. There are two places in the spinal cord that we find cerebrospinal fluid. What are the two places where we have cerebrospinal fluid in the spinal cord? Yeah, so the first place that we talked about at the beginning of class today with our group work, the Central Canal. Where is the Central Canal found again? What's the location of the Central Canal? How would we describe that? Yeah, the Central Canal is in the very middle of the spinal cord. It's that dot in the very middle of it. So one of the places that we have cerebrospinal fluid is in the Central Canal. The other place that we have it is the one we talked about just a moment ago, called the Sub Arachnoid Space, underneath the arachnoid mater. The Sub Arachnoid Space is on the outside of the spinal cord. We can reach it without touching the spinal cord. If we were to try to take cerebrospinal fluid from the Central Canal, we would have to damage those tracts that we were talking about earlier in class today, the white matter. So to get to the fluid in the Central Canal, we would damage the spinal cord. We don't want to do that. When we do a spinal tap, we call it a lumbar puncture, we're going to go into the subarachnoid space because that's the location where I can get cerebrospinal fluid, where there is cerebrospinal fluid, I can get it without risking damage to the spinal cord. So you have this picture, oh, we'll come back to, you have this picture in your packet. Notice that it shows when we're doing a spinal tap, a lumbar puncture is what they call it, we go into the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord. Notice right here, epidural anesthesia. We mentioned this before. When a woman is given an epidural, that epidural needle is only supposed to go into the epidural space. It's not supposed to go in through the meninges. It's not supposed to get inside the spinal cord. So an epidural, we go into the epidural space where there's all that adipose tissue on the outside of the spinal cord. When we do a spinal tap, we go into the subarachnoid space around the spinal cord. Now notice on our picture here, and this is something that was noted in the guided lesson for you. Notice that the spinal cord in the middle of this fluid-filled sac, the spinal cord doesn't go all the way to the end of the spinal column. If we were being more accurate on this picture, so I'll tell you right now what we're seeing on this picture was something called the filum terminal. The filum terminal, if you recall, that's the connective tissue that goes from the end of the spinal cord down to the end of the vertebral column to hold it in place. What else would I see right here after the end of the spinal cord, after the conus medullaris? What else would be down here? Do we remember? Let me draw some little lines here. Yeah, so we have the filum terminal. Yeah, the horsetail thing, right? That's totally fine. I'm not gonna make you spell it. My horsetail down here was called the cauda equina. The cauda equina. That's all these nerves that I see down here. When I'm doing a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture, when I send my needle in, keep in mind that this area isn't just empty. There's not just fluid down here. We have all of those nerves called the cauda equina down there. So the spinal cord ends up here around the level of the L1 or L2 vertebrae, but it sends down all of these little nerves to go down and out into the legs. When we do a spinal tap, our goal is to not damage the nerves down here. That being said, if I'm going to damage something, which hopefully I'm not, but if I'm going to damage something, I would much rather it be a nerve than it be my spinal cord up here. So the second question you had about spinal taps is about where we would want to do them in the body. When we do a spinal tap, when we're sending a needle into the vertebral column to get fluid, we want to put it into the vertebral column below the location where the spinal cord would be. We don't want to risk bumping into the spinal cord. So if we're up here at C1 or C2, remember C1 was called the atlas, C2 was called the axis. We definitely have the spinal cord up here. That's super dangerous. When we're at T1 or T2, we're in your chest. Again, we definitely have the spinal cord here. Between L1 and L2, this is probably about where we find that thing called the conus medullaris. This is probably the end of the spinal cord right here. So to be safe, to make sure we have the least chance of bumping into the spinal cord, we would do a spinal tap between L3 and L4, between your third lumbar vertebrae and your fourth lumbar vertebrae. We're going to do it down very low in your back. We'll go in between the spinous processes of L3 and L4. That's where we send the needle in to make sure we don't hit the spinal cord. So for these medical procedures, make sure you know which space around the spinal cord we're going into. whether it's the subarachnoid space or the epidural space. Make sure we know what we normally find in those places. So in the subarachnoid space, there's cerebrospinal fluid. In the epidural space, there's adipose tissue. If we know those kinds of things, that's the kind of information that we're looking for. While we're talking about the fluid-filled spaces in the spine, we should talk about a condition another medical condition for us to be familiar with, called Spina Bifida. Spina Bifida. So Spina Bifida is a medical condition where we have an issue with either the vertebral column or the spinal cord itself. Spina Bifida. There are 3 different versions of this condition, and we can use our pictures to help us identify them. So we're going to start over here on the left with what a normal spinal column looks like. Notice that we have spinous processes, the part that sticks out on those vertebrae, on all of the vertebrae here. The spinal cord shown here in gray, and all the meninges shown here in pink. In normal conditions, when you're back and everything develops correctly, this is what it should look like. What sometimes happens, we're going to go to this picture right here. What sometimes happens is one of the vertebrae might not close all the way on the back. So we might not have a spinous process on this particular vertebrae here. Typically, if that happens, where I don't form a spinous process here, I'm also going to see a little patch of hair on the lower back where that spinous process didn't develop. This is the least severe form of spina bifida. This is called Spina Bifida occulta. Spina Bifida occulta. Occulta means hidden. So you may not know that you're missing a spinous process, except for the fact that you have a little patch of hair that grows down here. Least severe, you might not have any problems if you have Spina Bifida occulta. Where we start to have problems is if we don't develop a spinous process and the meninges start to sneak out that hole that we had left. So if the meninges sneak out the hole where the spinous process didn't develop, this is a condition known as meningeocele. Meningeocele, where the meninges leave the vertebral column. So this would be full of cerebrospinal fluid. It's going to go up by the skin. You'd be able to see essentially into the spinal cord, into the spinal column. Not good news for us. What's really bad news though is if this meningeocele, we've got a big fluid-filled area that develops, but the spinal cord also goes out into that area. If the spinal cord goes out into the area where the meninges are out, we call that myelomeningocele. Myelomeningocele. The best way to remember it, myelo like myelin. So if I've got myelin going out into this bubble here, along with my meninges, this is the most severe form of spina bifida, when that spinal cord goes out of the vertebral column entirely. So spina bifida, an issue with the development of the vertebral column and possibly the meninges and the spinal cord as well. Another issue with the spinal cord is something called shingles. So shingles is a medical condition that will affect what are called dermatomes in the body. So dermatomes are a space in the body where all of the sensory information from a section of skin all goes back to the spinal cord through a particular spinal nerve. So the spinal cord has nerves that come out in between each of the vertebrae. You can see them all labeled here. And the information, the sensory information like touch and temperature and texture, all of that kind of information goes back to the spinal cord through spinal nerves. Notice when we're looking here at the trunk, for example, at the chest, we can see a line of skin that all sends its sensory information back to the spinal cord using the T7 spinal nerve. So the thoracic spinal nerve number 7. If we go up just a little bit higher, we see that all of that information goes back to the spinal cord using the T6, the thoracic 6 spinal nerve. When we're looking at the dermatomes, or the areas of skin that send their sensory information back to the spinal cord through a particular spinal nerve, notice that all of these lines, all of these dermatomes in the thorax, they're going horizontally. So basically it makes a circle around your thorax. When we start getting down into the legs though, notice how my dermatomes are arranged more vertically, where we're going up and down. So all of the sensory information that goes back to the spinal cord using the 4th lumbar spinal nerve, that starts up here on the outside of your thigh and kind of works its way around the front. Or the L5 lumbar nerve, that's sending its information from the top of the foot up across the top of the shin, up through the side. Dermatomes, again, just the areas of the skin where sensory information all goes back to the same place in the spinal cord. This, by the way, is where it's fun to do an experiment with people at home. You can put 2 fingers on someone's back inside the same dermatome, and they'll have a really hard time telling if there's 2 fingers there or if there's just 1. Or if you put 3 fingers down, they may not be able to distinguish between them. So all of the sensory information from one of these parts, one of these dermatomes, it all goes back through the same nerve. If that nerve is the location of the varicella virus, if it happens to live inside there and it gets reactivated, this is how a person develops what's called shingles. So shingles is caused by the varicella virus. Does anyone remember from your notes what other disease varicella causes? Yeah, varicella is the chickenpox virus. So when a person gets chickenpox, that virus gives them a rash all over their body, and then that virus likes to go and hide in the dorsal root ganglia of the nerves. It likes to live inside the part of the spinal cord where the sensory neurons live. Well, years later, whether it's 20 years, 30 years, 60 years later, if that varicella virus gets reactivated, the varicella virus goes from being dormant to activated again, it can cause a rash in the person. But the way that it works is it travels up the spinal nerve and goes to a part of the body. So say it was chilling out inside the dorsal root ganglion of the 3rd thoracic nerve. It gets reactivated and it goes out to the end of that nerve and it causes a rash just in that dermatome. That's what we see right here. So all the skin that leaves sensory information or sends sensory information back through that nerve, suddenly I've got this blistering rash, I've got shingles in that area. Or maybe that virus decided to chill out. Notice here how I've got a rash going along the back side of the arm. Maybe that virus chilled out in the dorsal root ganglion of C7. And so now when that virus becomes reactivated, it causes a skin rash along the dermatome or the skin that C7 talks to. Or we can see a rash here along the buttocks region. So maybe we chilled out down here in L5. Whatever dorsal root ganglion the neuron was living inside of, and when it becomes reactivated, it goes to the dermatome that nerve collects information from and causes this extremely painful rash. So shingles, another example of a spinal cord disorder, along with Spina Bifida. And I'll just mention the one last thing that you're learning about in this lesson is talking about quadriplegia, paraplegia, and hemiplegia. Quadriplegia is when a person damages or cannot move all 4 of their limbs. Quad means 4. Paraplegia means they have lost the use of their legs. Both of those conditions are caused when we damage the spinal cord, either somewhere below where the arms have their nerves coming out or above where the nerves coming out. But this critical thinking question that I posed for you asked about something different called hemiplegia. Hemiplegia is when we have an issue with either the left side or the right side of the body. When we talk about having problems with either the left side or the right side of the body, what might that be an issue with? If it's not the spinal cord, what might that be an issue with? Yeah, so Jacqueline is right in saying that it's a brain issue. She doesn't know why. Karina's right. She's chiming in with talking about it being caused by something like a stroke. So think about if we're talking about moving your right hand, where did the directions for you moving your right hand come from? When you move your right hand, do we remember where we decided that? Yeah, the motor homunculus on the left side. Exactly. When we talk about movements of the body, the left side of the body is controlled by the right side of the brain, and the right side of the body is controlled by the left side of the brain. If I only have issues with one half of my body, probably what happened is the opposite half of the brain is not working. Maybe I had a stroke, maybe I have a tumor, maybe there's some brain damage. If only half of my body is paralyzed, that probably means I'm not sending directions to that half of the body. If I lose all of my movement in my two lower limbs, that's an issue with the spinal cord, not letting any information go through. Or if I lose the ability to use any of my limbs, all four of my limbs, that's an issue with the spinal cord. If I lose the ability to move half of my body, that's probably an issue with the brain, because each half of the brain controls each half of the body. We're over time. I talked way too much. But before I end our recording, before we wrap up lesson number 12, any last minute questions? Yeah, so Jacqueline, we're wanting to kind of like if you remember with the brain, how there were a lot of different kind of big picture ideas that we talked about with the brain. It's definitely this chapter is similar to the brain in that regard. Although do make sure you can make predictions about the tracts. Make sure we can make predictions about our reflexes, those kind of things. Know the big ideas for some of these medical conditions, how they work, and then make sure you can make some of those predictions. And yeah, Karina is correct in answering Nicole's question. Shingles does not just have to be in old people. We typically think about it in older people, but shingles it's just a condition that anyone can develop if their immune system is suppressed. However, something has to happen for you to get shingles. What would have to happen first before you could get shingles? Any idea? Yeah, so anyone who has shingles, anyone who ever gets shingles, at some point in their life, they needed to have had chickenpox. Because chickenpox is the source of the varicella virus. So it bugs me when people say that, oh, see, people are getting shingles because they got the chickenpox vaccine. No, people are getting shingles because they had chickenpox when they were a kid, and the chickenpox virus is hiding in their body. So if you're going to get shingles, you had to have had chickenpox first. That virus chills out in your dorsal root ganglion until your immune system gets suppressed, maybe because you're stressed and you're tired, kind of like this time in the semester, right? So anybody who has had chickenpox can develop shingles. Old or young, it does not discriminate. If your immune system is suppressed, shingles just might come out. Varicella might come out to play, put it that way. All right, well, that's all I've got for today. That's all I've got for lesson 12. Tomorrow we are going to start lesson number 13. So if you have time, consider looking over the beginning of lesson number 13, special senses. That's the last thing we got going on. So we'll pick that up tomorrow, work our way through that stuff, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to turn off the recording. I'll stick around for a couple minutes if there are any last minute questions. Otherwise, have a great afternoon.